The poison was already in his blood when Eloise Ravenscroft slammed her palm against the great obsidian doors of the Blackthorne Court and screamed his name. She did not belong here. Every pale, cold face turning toward her in the vast chamber made that abundantly clear. Lords and ladies of the vampire nobility, draped in silks the color of midnight and dried roses, stared at the young woman in her black server's apron, with an expression that fell somewhere between contempt and amusement. A human, a waitress, standing in the sacred hall of the most powerful vampire court in the northern hemisphere, demanding entry like she owned the marble floor beneath her sneakers. "Remove her," said a voice like cracking ice. It belonged to a lord near the dais, tall and white-haired as all the rest, his silver eyes narrowing into slits. He wore a circlet of black iron at his brow, and his name was Vale Mordecris, and Eloise had heard enough in the last 40 minutes to know that he was the one who had done it. "I will not be removed," she said, and her voice did not shake. It should have. She was 24 years old, entirely mortal, standing in a room full of beings who could drain her dry before she finished the sentence. But her voice did not shake because she had something none of them expected her to have. She had the truth and she had the antidote, and she had approximately 12 minutes before neither of those things would matter anymore. "The king is dying," she said, loud enough that the words rang off the vaulted ceiling, "and the man who poisoned him is standing on his left." The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence Eloise had ever heard, and then, from behind the carved throne of black wood and silver, a figure moved. Guards, armored in dark plate, stepped forward with weapons drawn. Eloise did not flinch. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small glass vial filled with liquid the color of liquid moonlight, holding it up so the bioluminescent torches of the court could catch it and throw its light across every watching face. "This is the only dose of the counter compound that exists," she said. "I need to reach him now." This was not how any of this was supposed to go. She had been working at Nocturne, the sleek and impeccably designed restaurant that occupied the ground floor of a building in central London, which most of the city's human population believed was simply a very exclusive private members' club. She had taken the job 8 months ago because the pay was extraordinary, and the hours allowed her to finish her postgraduate research in biochemistry during the day. She had signed the usual contracts, including several clauses that made considerably more sense once she understood what the establishment actually was. Nocturne was the public face of the Blackthorne Court, and the Blackthorne Court was the seat of Lazare Blackthorne, king of the northern vampire realm, sovereign of every vampire territory between Iceland and the eastern reaches of Poland. Eloise had not known any of that when she took the job. She had known it by the end of her first week, because she was not the sort of person who ignored what was directly in front of her face. And what was directly in front of her face on her third shift was a conversation between 2 of the senior staff members that contained the words, "Blood Covenant, the Old Court, and do not let the king see this document." She had filed those words away carefully, as she filed away everything, and kept her head down and her ears open and her tips impressive enough that no one questioned why she stayed. She had met Lazare Blackthorne for the first time on a Tuesday evening 5 months ago, when he had come through the private dining room on his way to the lower court chambers, and paused because she was blocking the corridor, crouched on the floor and carefully taping down a power cable that had been left as a tripping hazard by the events team. "You are going to enormous effort," he had said, "for a cable that could simply be moved." She had looked up. The breath had left her body for one moment, not from fear exactly, though there was an element of that, but from the simple shock of him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and white-haired in a way that no human man his apparent age, which looked somewhere in his late 30s, ever was. His skin was pale as winter moonlight, his features carved and precise, and his eyes were the deep, absolute silver of old Mercury. He wore a dark suit that fit him with the precision of something tailored in another century, and he stood with the absolute stillness of something that had existed long enough to stop wasting motion on unnecessary things. "If I move it," she had said, "whoever left it here will leave it again tomorrow. If I tape it down properly, it becomes part of the infrastructure and people walk around it." He had looked at her for a long moment. "That is remarkably strategic thinking for a hazard cable." I'm a remarkably strategic thinker, she had said, and gone back to the tape. He had laughed. It was a quiet sound, but it was real, and she had felt it in her sternum like a struck bell. She had not known yet exactly what he was. She had her suspicions, but in that moment he was simply a man in a corridor who had laughed at something she said, and the warmth of it had followed her all the way home. That had been 5 months ago. In the months between that corridor and this throne room, a great many things had happened, almost none of them planned, and all of them inevitable in retrospect. She had learned his name from the other staff. She had learned what he was from the documents she was never meant to see. Filed in a system she had accessed not through subterfuge, but through the simple accident of being assigned the wrong administrative login during a software update. She had read 2 screens worth of ancient vampire court records before she realized what she was reading, and had logged out immediately, and had spent 3 days deciding what to do about it. She had decided to do nothing, because it was not her business, and because every instinct she had said that the man in the corridor who laughed at her cable tape was not a threat to her. That instinct had been right. Lazare had begun coming to Nocturne more frequently after that evening, and specifically to the section Eloise worked. She had noticed. She had been unsure whether to feel flattered or alarmed. She had settled on paying careful attention, because careful attention was her primary method of navigating the world, and what careful attention revealed was that he was watching her the way you watched something rare and unfamiliar, something you did not yet have a name for, with a kind of focused, intent wonder. He had spoken to her properly for the first time 3 weeks later, when the restaurant was quiet, and he had lingered after the rest of his party left. He had ordered a glass of something she strongly suspected was not wine, and when she brought it, he had asked her name. Eloise Ravenscroft, she said. That is a name with some history to it, he said. It is. My family have a great deal of history and very little money, which is the worst possible combination. She had said it lightly because it was simply true. He had smiled, and she had felt that bell strike again, deeper this time. What do you study? He asked, and she had startled because she had not told him she studied anything. Biochemistry, she said. How did you know? You smell of the laboratory, he said simply, and then looked briefly, genuinely caught out, as though he had not meant to say that aloud. The vulnerability in it had undone her completely. Right, she said. Vampire, yes. And watched his expression shift through surprise and then to something careful and assessing. You know what I am, he said. It was not a question. I know what you are, she confirmed. I am not going to make it a problem, but I would appreciate the same courtesy in return. He had looked at her for a very long moment. The silver eyes moved across her face with a precision that felt like being read every page turned with careful attention. You are not afraid, he said. I am moderately afraid, she said honestly. But I have found that moderately afraid and completely stupid are not the same thing, and I refuse to be completely stupid about this. He had laughed again, and this time it was not quiet. This time it was full and genuine, and it changed his face entirely, stripped away the centuries-old gravity of it, and left something younger and more real. And Eloise Ravenscroft had understood in that moment, with the clarity of a chemical reaction completing itself, that she was in a great deal of trouble. They had talked for 2 hours. He had told her things, careful things. Measured disclosures that she understood were enormous concessions from a being who measured trust in decades. She had told him things in return because fairness demanded it, and because she wanted to, which was a stranger and more dangerous thing. She had told him about her research, about the biochemical compounds she was investigating that interfaced with non-human cellular structures. Work she had begun without fully understanding where it was pointed. He had gone very still when she described it. You are studying us, he said. Not accusatory, thoughtful. I am studying the cellular mechanics of extended life, she said. You are the most instructive example available. And do I get a say in being studied? You get every say, she said. I would not do it without consent. That is rather the point of ethical research. He had looked at her for a long time after that, and the expression on his face was something she could not fully name. It was the look of a man who had not been surprised in a very long time, confronted with something genuinely unexpected. They had met 14 more times over the following weeks, sometimes at nocturne, twice in the lower court chambers, where he had taken her with the gravity of someone presenting something precious to something dangerous, and the court had watched her with cold silver eyes and said nothing, because the king's will was not questioned openly. Once she had met him in the reading room of a private library in Mayfair that turned out to be an extension of the Blackthorne Court's archives, where she had spent 4 hours reading documents that predated the printing press, while he watched her with that same focused wonder she could not stop noticing. She had kissed him in that library, standing between shelves of manuscripts that were older than most of the nations currently on the map, and he had gone perfectly still beneath her mouth for the space of one breath. And then his arms had come around her with a contained intensity that was more eloquent than any declaration, and she had understood that whatever this was, it was not small. "This is not simple," he had said when they came apart. His forehead rested against hers, and his eyes were very close, that extraordinary silver. "Nothing worth having is simple," she said. "I am a biochemist in a vampire court who is developing feelings for the king. I think we are well past simple." "Developing," he repeated, and the slight emphasis was precise and warm and devastating. "Developed," she amended, and he made a sound against her temple that she would hear in her sleep for weeks afterward. But there was the court to contend with. There was always the court. The Blackthorne Court had been operating under a blood law for 300 years, a compact made by Lazare's predecessor, which bound the ruling king to take a vampire consort of noble blood within the first century of his reign. Lazare was 80 years into his reign. He had refused every presented candidate. The court had been patient, then restless, then something colder and more calculating than either. Vale Mordecris was the primary architect of that calculation. Eloise had learned this gradually, the way you learn the layout of a building you are going to have to escape from, by paying attention, by listening, by asking the right questions of the right people. Vale was ancient, aristocratic, and possessed of a daughter named Seraphine, who was widely considered the most eligible noble vampire in the northern realm. Vale wanted the blood law enforced. He wanted his daughter on the throne, and he had developed, over the 80 years of Lazare's reign, a particular and focused hatred for anything that stood in the way of that ambition. When Eloise had begun appearing in the court, the hatred had found a new target. She had been aware of it. She had told Lazare she was aware of it, on an evening 6 weeks ago when they were sitting in his private chambers in the lower court, which were nothing like what she had expected, warm and book-lined and lit by lamps rather than torches, deeply lived in the way of spaces that have been genuinely inhabited for centuries. "Mordecris is dangerous," she had said. "Mordecris is ambitious," Lazare had said, "which makes him predictable. Predictable men with ancient power and access to your food supply are still dangerous," she had said. "I am a biochemist, Lazare. I know what access to food supply means." He had looked at her very sharply then. "You think he would use poison. I think it is the logical move for a man who cannot challenge you directly, because you would destroy him, but who cannot afford to leave you in power long enough to change the law." She had watched him process this. What does the blood law actually say? The specific language. He had been quiet for a moment. It states that the reigning king must take a vampire consort of noble blood, or forfeit the throne to the next noble claimant upon the court's determination of incapacity. Incapacity, she had repeated. That is the word, not death, incapacity. Yes, so if you were incapacitated, even temporarily, the court could declare a succession, in theory, with a 2/3 vote of the noble council. And how many of those votes does Mordecris control? Lazare had been very still. "He is persuasive. He has most of them," she said. "I counted the alliances. I have been counting them for 3 weeks." She had produced her notes, a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket, dense with names and connections written in her precise, small handwriting. He had stared at it for a long moment, and then at her, with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she did something that genuinely moved him. "You have been protecting me," he said quietly. "I have been gathering information," she said. "What you do with it is your decision, Eloise." His voice was different when he said her name. Lower, more deliberate, as though it were a word in a language he was learning to speak. "Look at me." She had looked at him. The silver eyes were very serious and very warm at once, which was a combination she would never quite get used to. "You are the most extraordinary person I have met in 400 years, he said, "and I am aware that is a significant sample size." "It is," she agreed, and her voice was not quite steady. "I will not let Mordecai touch you," he said, and the way he said it was not reassurance. It was a statement of fact delivered with the quiet certainty of something that had already been decided, a law of the universe he was simply clarifying for her benefit. "Whatever he plans, whatever the court demands, whatever the blood law says, he will not touch you." "I know," she said, and she did know, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all, but they had not moved fast enough. Or rather, Mordecai had moved faster than either of them had calculated, which was a failure of imagination on their part, because they had been thinking about the blood law and the council and the political mechanics of the court. And Mordecai had been thinking about something far simpler. The dinner had been a formal court occasion, one of the quarterly gatherings where the noble houses presented themselves to the king, and the alliances and grievances of the realm were aired with magnificent civility over food and aged blood and conversation that carried the weight of centuries. Eloise had not been present officially. She had been working at Nocturne, the upstairs face of the operation, because Lazare had said, with a careful and deliberate frustration, that it was safer for her to remain upstairs while the full court assembled. She had agreed, because she understood the political calculus of it. Her presence in formal court was a provocation to every noble house that wanted the blood law enforced. Lazare was managing the situation, and she trusted his management. What she had not anticipated was that Mordecai would not wait for a formal political confrontation. He had done something far more direct. He had gotten to the blood supply. She had found out because of Cassia. Cassia was a young vampire, barely 2 decades in her transformation, who worked the service corridors of Nocturne and the court with the quiet efficiency of someone who was entirely aware of her low status and had decided to make herself indispensable rather than resentful. She had taken to Eloise in the early weeks with a warmth that Eloise suspected was partly because Eloise treated her exactly the same as she treated every other colleague, without the reflexive fear that most humans would have carried. They had developed a friendship of small kindnesses, extra coffee from Eloise, useful information about court schedules from Cassia, and a mutual agreement to watch each other's backs in an environment that was not always kind to those without power. Cassia had come running up the back stairs to Nocturne 47 minutes ago, her face white as chalk, even by vampire standards, her eyes wide, and had grabbed Eloise by the arm and said, in a voice barely above a breath, "They have dosed the king's blood with Sorvain compound, Lord Mordecai. I overheard it in the lower corridors. There is a meeting of the noble council called for midnight. They are going to declare him incapacitated before he can raise the alarm." Eloise had looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "How long does Sorvain compound take to reach full incapacitation?" Cassia stared at her. "You know what Sorvain compound is? It is a compound derived from certain minerals found in cave systems beneath the Carpathian Mountains, which interfere with the blood processing centers of vampire physiology and cause progressive paralysis and cognitive impairment over a period of approximately an hour." She said it the same way she would state any fact she had already verified. "I know what it is because I have been studying vampire biochemistry for 18 months, and Sorvain compound is one of the most documented toxins in the historical literature. What I need to know is how long ago it was administered." "Cassia heard the discussion perhaps 35 minutes ago," Cassia said, using the distancing third person she sometimes fell into when frightened. "She does not know when he actually consumed it."
"Then we have a window,"
Eloise said, and went to her coat. She had kept the counter compound in her laboratory, because she was a biochemist who had been paying careful attention for months, and who had read enough about Sorvain compound to synthesize the antidote as a precautionary measure. She had not told Lazare about it, because she had not wanted to alarm him and had privately hoped she would never need it. She had apparently hoped incorrectly. She had retrieved it from the small insulated case she kept in the staff locker room for laboratory samples, because she was precisely the kind of person who kept laboratory samples in a case in her locker and had come down through the lower passages that Cassia knew. And Eloise had memorized and had walked through those obsidian doors and said his name. The court stared at her. Vale Mordecris stared at her with an expression that had passed rapidly through surprise and was now settling into something cold and calculating. "The girl has no standing in this court," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Whatever she claims, she cannot administer anything to the king without the consent of the noble council, and the noble council is convening to discuss His Majesty's current state of health." "His Majesty's current state of health is a direct result of you poisoning him," Eloise said, "and I do not need the noble council's permission to save his life." "Guards." Mordecris did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 3 armored figures moved toward her from the left side of the room. Eloise did not move. She kept the vial visible, held steady, because she was thinking very quickly, and what she was thinking was this. If they took the vial from her, there was no second dose, and Lazare would be declared incapacitated, and Mordecris would have the throne. So the vial could not be taken, which meant she had to get it to Lazare before the guards reached her, which meant she needed about 15 seconds and a clear path. She did not have a clear path. But she did have Cassia, who had followed her through the service door at the back of the chamber, and was now visible to approximately no one, because every eye in the room was on Eloise. "Lady Mordecris," Eloise said, pitching her voice to carry the same way his had. "Your father has committed treason against the blood law itself. The blood law requires an unimpaired sovereign to consent to any council decision regarding succession. A king incapacitated by deliberate poisoning does not meet the condition of natural incapacity the law requires. You know this. Every lord and lady in this room knows this." She watched the faces. She watched several of them shift. What Mordecris has done is not the enforcement of the blood law. It is the subversion of it. And when the king recovers, as he will know every name in this room and what each of you chose to do in the next 60 seconds. The guards were still moving, but they were moving slower, because guards of a vampire court were also vassals of a vampire court, and the speech had landed in the room the way she had calculated it would, with the force of a legal argument that everyone present understood the implications of. "Take her," Mordecris said sharply, and the guards lurched back into motion. From the back of the chamber, Cassia moved. She was small and young and low-ranking, and she moved with the speed that even new vampires possessed, a burst of motion too fast for human eyes to fully track, and she was simply there, between Eloise and the guards, her arms spread and her face set with a determination that Eloise suspected had surprised even Cassia herself. "The girl carries the antidote," Cassia said, and her voice was shaking, but she did not move. "By court law, any individual in possession of a remedy for a direct threat to the king's life has the right of royal passage. Even a human." The room was utterly silent. Eloise had not known about that law. She suspected Cassia had either made it up or was interpreting something extremely liberally. Either way, it bought her 3 seconds, and 3 seconds was enough. She ran, not toward the guards, toward the side of the dais, where there was a passage she had identified on her second visit to the lower court, because she always identified exits, and through it and down the corridor that she knew led to the king's private chambers, where Cassia had told her he had retreated when the symptoms began, because he was apparently the sort of man who preferred to suffer in private rather than show weakness to his court. She heard shouting behind her. She heard the sound of movement, several sets of footsteps, fast and certain, and gaining on her. She did not look back. The door to his chambers was ahead. It was closed. She hit it with her shoulder, and the latch gave, and she was inside. The room was dim, lamplit, warm with old books, and the particular scent she had come to associate with him, cold stone and something dark and herbal underneath. And he was there. Lazare was seated in the chair near the window, and he was very still in the particular way that was wrong. The way that was not his natural stillness, but the stillness of something being suppressed by force of will alone. His head was up, his jaw set, his eyes very bright and very silver, and when she came through the door he rose to his feet with the instinctive command of something that would not be seen as diminished regardless of what was happening to it. "Eloise," he said, and it was the first time she had ever heard her name in his voice when the voice itself was unsteady. "Sit down," she said, and crossed the room in 6 steps. "I do not require." "You have Sorvain compound in your blood," and approximately 9 minutes before full paralysis, and I have the counter-compound, and I need you to sit down and hold out your arm, she said, and her voice was completely steady. The way it always went when the stakes were highest, which was something she had always been both grateful for and slightly unsettled by. He looked at her, and something in his face broke open. It was the smallest thing, a fracture in that extraordinary composure, but she saw it, and then he sat down and held out his arm. She administered the counter-compound with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 2 years in laboratory settings, and then she remained there, kneeling beside the chair with her hands wrapped around his arm, feeling the fine tremor in his muscles that he would never acknowledge but could not entirely hide. "Mordecris," he said. "Yes. How long have you known it was a risk?" 6 weeks, she said. "I told you 6 weeks ago. You told me he was dangerous," he said. "You did not tell me you had synthesized an antidote." "No," she said. "I was hoping not to need it, Eloise." His free hand came up and touched her face with a precision and gentleness that was devastating in the context of everything that was happening, the shouting from the corridor, the crisis, the 400 years of dangerous authority contained in the body in the chair. His fingers were very cold. They were always very cold. She had stopped minding that weeks ago. "You walked into my court and accused my first noble lord of treason and ran through my corridors to save my life." "Yes," she said. "That is what happened. Why?" She looked up at him, and the silver eyes were very close and very serious and very, very tired, in the way of something that has been fighting alone for a very long time. "Because I am in love with you," she said. "And also because Mordecris was going to steal your throne and put his daughter on it, which is an injustice I find personally offensive." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. His hand moved from her face to her hair with a tenderness that she felt in every part of her. "Both reasons are equally compelling," he said. "I thought you would appreciate that." "Come up here," he said, and moved his arm so there was space beside him in the chair, which was large enough for this and had probably been designed for it in some earlier century, when the scale of furniture was more generous. She sat beside him, and his arm went around her with the same contained certainty it always had, and she leaned against him and listened to the commotion in the corridor and calculated that they had perhaps 4 minutes before someone came through the door. "The counter-compound will take approximately 20 minutes to reach full efficacy," she said. "Your motor function and cognition should be unimpaired within 10. How do you feel?" "Like I have been betrayed by a man I have spent 80 years tolerating," he said. "That is not a medical symptom." "No," he agreed. "Physically, I feel the tremor reducing already. Your compound is well made." "It is," she said, with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly how well she had made something. "The court," he said. "The court is in chaos. Mordecris overplayed. He has been operating on the assumption that I was insignificant, and that assumption has cost him his main strategic advantage, which was timing. You are going to recover before the council can legitimately convene." And I made a public argument in the throne room that approximately 40 vampire nobles heard, which means the legal case against what he did is already in the room. "The legal case," he repeated. "You made a legal case in my court. Someone had to." He was quiet for a moment. The tremor in his arm was noticeably less. The Sorvain compound was retreating. "The blood law still stands," he said. "Yes," she said. "The court will not accept a human consort under the existing law." "No," she said, "but the existing law can be changed. Laws of that age require a unanimous vote of the noble council, or the direct authority of the reigning king." "You are the reigning king," she said, "and you have the direct authority. I cannot unilaterally rewrite a 300-year compact without fracturing the court." "No," she agreed. "But you can present it as what it is, which is a law that has been used to commit treason. A law that was wielded as a weapon against the throne it was meant to protect. Every noble in that room just watched Mordecris use the blood law as cover for a coup attempt. The blood law's legitimacy has been compromised by the man most loudly demanding its enforcement. That is the argument you make." He was very still against her. She could feel him thinking, the ancient, precise machinery of a mind that had been reading courts and politics for 4 centuries, running through what she had said. "That is a formidable argument," he said slowly. "It is the true argument," she said. which is the best kind. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him. And they were very close in the lamplight, with the corridor outside still echoing with raised voices, and the whole complex weight of the court pressing on them from every direction, and she thought she had never in her life seen anyone look at her the way he was looking at her right now. "Eloise Ravenscroft," he said. "Lazare Blackthorne," she replied. "I have spent 400 years in this court, and I have never," he said with a deliberation that made every word land separately, "wanted anything the way I want you." "I know," she said. "I am a biochemist. I have been observing the data for months." He kissed her then, with the full weight of everything he was, and she kissed him back with everything she was. And the door did not open for another 3 minutes, which was exactly the right amount of time. What came through the door when it did open was not a guard. It was Cassia, breathing hard, with 3 senior court functionaries behind her, and the expression of someone who has just done something much larger than they were prepared for, and is running on sheer adrenaline. "Your Majesty," Cassia said, and her voice steadied when she saw that he was upright and alert. "The Noble Council is in emergency session. Lord Mordecris is attempting to proceed with the incapacity declaration on the basis that the compound was already administered and the effects are irreversible." "The effects are very much reversible," Lazare said, and stood, and the tremor was gone entirely, and what replaced it was everything that 400 years of sovereign authority looked like when it was fully present and completely intact. He straightened to his full height, and the room felt smaller. "Have my council chamber prepared. I will address the court in 10 minutes. "Your Majesty," said one of the functionaries. A severe and ancient-looking woman named Thessaly, who had the title of court recorder and the bearing of someone who had seen 17 kings. "It is not within procedure for the king to address a council session called for the purpose of Thessaly," Lazare said pleasantly. "Has the council formally opened the session?" "Not formally, no, because the quorum was still assembling." "Then the session has not begun," he said, "and I will address my court before it does. Prepare the chamber." Thessaly looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating several things simultaneously. Then she inclined her head and left with the functionaries behind her. Cassia remained, looking at Eloise with wide eyes. "You were remarkable," Eloise told her. "The right of royal passage." Cassia's expression went slightly complicated. "I may have interpreted an older law regarding battlefield medics rather liberally." "It worked," Eloise said. "That is what matters. Are you all right?" "I am terrified," Cassia said simply, "but I am well." Lazare looked at Cassia with a measured attention that made the young vampire straighten involuntarily. "You risked considerable standing to act tonight," he said. "The court will know what you did." "Yes, Your Majesty," Cassia said quietly. "I know it. I protect those who protect what is mine," he said, and it was the same tone he had used when he told Eloise that Mordecris would not touch her. The statement of a law of the universe. "You will not suffer for tonight. I give you my word." Cassia's eyes went bright in a way that was not vampire silver, but something much more human. And she nodded and excused herself quickly before the brightness could become anything else. Lazare turned back to Eloise. He reached out and adjusted the collar of her apron with 2 careful fingers, a small and deliberate gesture. "You are still in your uniform," he observed. "I came rather directly from my shift," she said. "You will stand with me," he said. "In the council chamber, not behind me, not to the side. With me." She looked at him. "That will be a statement." "It is intended to be a statement." She considered this. She thought about the faces in the throne room, the cold silver eyes, the ancient contempt. She thought about standing in that council chamber in her work apron, while vampire nobles in their centuries-old finery looked at her and calculated what she represented. She thought about Lazare beside her. "All right," she said. He offered her his arm, the formal court gesture, the one she had seen him use with noble visitors and heads of allied courts, precise and deliberate and unambiguous in its meaning. She took it. They walked out of the private chambers together, and the court that was gathered in the corridor did not speak. But the quality of their silence was different now. It was the silence of reassessment. The council chamber was large and circular, walled in black stone and lit by a ring of torches that gave the room the quality of a contained fire, warm and dangerous in equal measure. The noble council occupied their seats, 43 vampires of varying age and ancient lineage, and at the end of the room, Vale Mordecris sat in his chair with the composure of a man who had staked everything on a sequence of events and was watching it deviate. Lazare walked to the center of the chamber and stopped, and the room went utterly silent. He was, Eloise thought, the most commanding presence she had ever been in the physical vicinity of, and she had been in the vicinity of some remarkable people. But there was something about him in this moment that was beyond command. It was the quality of something ancient and certain standing in the place it had always belonged. A rightness that filled the room, the way a great chord fills a concert hall. "Lords and ladies of the Blackthorne Court," he said, and his voice filled the chamber without effort, "I understand a session has been called to discuss my capacity to rule." No one spoke. "I am here," he said, "to make that discussion very brief." He looked at Mordecris, and the look was not angry. It was colder and more precise than anger, the way a surgical instrument is colder and more precise than a knife. "Vale Mordecris administered Sorvain compound to my blood supply tonight. I am aware of the specific vintage, the method of delivery, and the involvement of 3 of his household staff. I have not yet determined the full extent of the conspiracy, but I will, and the court's full investigative process will follow. What I can tell the council now is that I am unimpaired, that the compound has been counted, and that the session called for this evening is without legal basis." Mordecris rose from his chair. "Your Majesty, with respect, I was not inviting your participation," Mordecris, Lazare said. "You will sit down." Mordecris sat down. "The blood law," Lazare continued, "requires that a determination of incapacity be made on the basis of natural impairment, not deliberate poisoning. This is the foundational reading of the compact, as any serious legal study of the original text will confirm. What was attempted tonight is not the enforcement of the blood law. It is treason committed under its cover, and I will not allow that distinction to be ignored." He paused, and the pause was exact and deliberate. "I also intend," he said, "to present a formal revision to the blood law's consort clause at the next formal session of this council. The existing clause, which has been demonstrably weaponized to facilitate an attempt on the reigning sovereign's capacity, requires review. I will propose specific language, and I will expect a substantive legal discussion. That is not tonight's matter. Tonight's matter is the treason of Lord Mordecris, which I am formally declaring before this council, and which will be investigated according to full court procedure." The room was very still. "The individual who counted the compound and preserved the throne tonight," Lazare said, and his voice carried something different now. "Something deliberate and personal and absolutely public, stands beside me. Her name is Eloise Ravenscroft. She is human, she is extraordinarily intelligent, and she is under my direct protection, which means she is under the protection of this court, and any member of this court who fails to understand that will answer to me boustonely." Eloise looked out at 43 pale, silver-eyed faces, and kept her own face entirely composed. She could feel the tension in the room, the complex pressure of centuries of tradition meeting, a fact they had not been prepared for. Some of the faces were hostile, some were calculating. A few were something she recognized with cautious relief as respect. One of the oldest lords in the room, a gaunt and ancient figure named Kerith Voss, who had the reputation of caring about nothing except legal precedent and vampire history, spoke. His voice was dry as old paper. "The king's right to declare a formal accusation is not in question," he said, "nor is his right to stand where he chooses with whom he chooses. Mordecris overstepped, that much is evident." He looked at Eloise with eyes that were not hostile, but were extremely sharp. The girl made a sound argument in the throne room, an unexpectedly sound argument. The court will hear it properly in the coming sessions. It was not a welcome, but it was not a rejection either. It was something more valuable, which was a serious engagement from someone whose opinion carried weight. "That is enough for tonight," Lazare said. "The council is dismissed. Mordecris will be confined to his chambers under court guard, pending investigation." The guards moved. Mordecris rose and turned to Lazare with an expression that had abandoned all pretense and was simply, openly furious. "You cannot make this permanent," he said. "The court will not accept a human on the throne. The blood law exists for a reason. Our strength, our continuity, our purity is not yours to decide," Lazare said. and the quiet in it was more absolute than any raised voice. "You have spent 80 years maneuvering for power in my court, Mordecai. You have spent tonight committing treason. Whatever arguments you wish to make about the blood law, you have permanently disqualified yourself from making them, because you chose to enforce what you believed was right through poison and conspiracy, rather than through law and deliberation. You do not believe in the blood law, you believe in power, and you have lost it." He paused. "Take him to his chambers." They took him, the counsel filed out, and as they went the quality of the looks directed at Eloise shifted further. The calculation was still there, the unease was still there. But the open contempt had largely gone, replaced by something more complicated, the reassessment of people who had assumed something and been wrong. When the chamber was empty except for the two of them, and Cassia hovering near the door, with the expression of someone who had run a marathon and was not yet sure they had finished, Lazare turned to Eloise. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the formality was entirely gone, and it was simply him asking, with all the directness of someone who genuinely needed the answer. "I am fine," she said. "Are you?" "I am better than I have been in decades," he said, and the warmth in it was so entirely unguarded that she had to look away for a moment because it was a great deal to bear, being the reason for that look. "The investigation into Mordecai," she said, "will it hold?" "It will hold," he said. "Kerith Voss will ensure the process is legally sound because Kerith Voss cannot abide procedural irregularity in any direction. Mordecai will be stripped of his house's noble standing pending trial. His daughter is not implicated yet, but she will be interviewed." "Seraphine may genuinely not have known," Eloise said. "She had a thought about this. She is ambitious, but I have not seen anything to suggest she would have endorsed poisoning." "No," he agreed. "I will extend the court's protection to her pending investigation. It is only just." She looked at him. The lamplight was catching the extraordinary white of his hair and the silver of his eyes, and she thought with a clarity that was almost painful that she had never expected this. Not any of it. Not the vampire court, or the blood law, or the running through corridors with an antidote in her apron pocket. Not the way he looked at her. Not the way she felt when he did. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the blood law revision. I will argue it before the council," he said. "Kerith Voss will scrutinize the language, which is actually useful because he will find every weakness in the drafting. The revision will not happen immediately. It may take months. The court will debate it with the seriousness they apply to all matters of ancient law. And while it is being debated, you are under my protection and you are treated as such by every member of this court. That is not a legal status," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is my word, and in this court my word has the force of law." He paused. "I would not ask you to wait for a legal framework that may take time to establish. If you want Lazare," she said. "Yes. I am a woman who synthesized an antidote for a vampire toxin in her spare time and kept it in an insulated case in her locker on the off chance she would need it someday," she said. "I am not someone who walks away from something because the framework is not yet established. I know what I want. I want to be here. I want to be with you. The law catching up to that fact is a process, and processes are manageable. That is not what concerns me." He was very law still in the way that meant he was paying absolute attention. "Then what concerns you?" She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honesty, and she had never been in the habit of anything else. "I am human," she said. "I am mortal. I will age, and you will not. I will die, and you will not, unless something extraordinary happens. That is a gap that does not close easily, and I do not know how you feel about it, and I think I need to know." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and true, the way it always was when he said something he had thought about for a very long time. "I have lived 400 years, he said. "I have watched people I valued age and die. I have kept my distance from mortal connections, because the loss of them is a specific and irreplaceable kind of grief." He looked at her steadily. "I did not keep my distance from you. I am aware of why." "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because you are worth it," he said simply. "Whatever duration, whatever grief waits at the end of this, you are worth it. And I knew it from the first time you looked up at me from the floor with a roll of tape in your hand and told me you were a strategic thinker." Something crossed his face that was old and real and entirely vulnerable. I have been careful for 400 years, Eloise. I am tired of careful. I would rather have you for whatever time there is than spend the next 400 years being careful. She crossed the space between them and put her arms around him, and his arms came around her with the immediate certainty of something that has been waiting for permission, and she pressed her face against the cold solidity of chest and felt him breathe, the slight rise and fall that was more habit than necessity, and thought that there was something extraordinary about the fact that she was here in this position, in this life, in this particular love. I am researching extended life, she said, against his chest. Cellular mechanics, you are the most instructive example available. She felt his laugh, that low, real sound she had stored up like something precious. You are saying you may find a solution to the mortality gap. I am saying I am already looking, she said. I make no promises about timelines. You are remarkable, he said. I know, she said. You have mentioned that. I will keep mentioning it, he said, indefinitely. She looked up at him. I am going to hold you to that. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth, very gently and very deliberately, the way he did everything, with that focused attention that made every point of contact feel considered and real. Stay tonight, he said. Not in the court, not formally. In my chambers, where I can know you are safe, because it has been a very eventful evening, and my instinct is not to let you out of my immediate vicinity. That is a very transparent, protective instinct, she said. I am not attempting to be subtle about it, he said. She thought about her flat in North London, which was small and quiet, and filled with her books and her research notes, and her own particular solitude, which she had always valued. She thought about staying here in this ancient lamplit space, with this man who was not a man, but was the most genuinely real presence she had ever encountered. All right, she said. But I need to contact my research supervisor first thing in the morning. Of course, he said, and I am keeping my flat. Of course, he said again, with the same immediate respect for her autonomy that he had always shown, that had been one of the first and most important things she had noticed about him. He had never once made her feel that what she was to him required her to be less than herself. In the weeks that followed, the Blackthorne Court underwent the most significant political reconfiguration it had seen in a century. The investigation into Vale Mordicus proceeded under Carith Voss's meticulous direction, and the full architecture of the conspiracy unravelled with the methodical horror of something that had been built carefully over many years. Mordicus had cultivated allies, managed alliances, and positioned himself with a patience that was genuinely impressive and genuinely chilling. 3 other noble lords were found to have been aware of the poisoning plan and had offered no warning. They were stripped of court privileges and placed under formal censure. 2 more were implicated in earlier, less dramatic attempts to pressure Lazare into the blood law compliance. Attempts that had been more subtle but were no less coercive. The noble council, confronted with the evidence of how far the manipulation had gone, was collectively shaken in a way that was useful. The blood law revision, when Lazare formally presented it, was met with considerably less resistance than it might have received before that night. Carith Voss did indeed find 17 weaknesses in the initial drafting language, which led to 6 weeks of intensive revision sessions, in which Eloise participated as a silent presence, with a legal dictionary, and the habit of asking extremely precise questions that made the court functionaries rethink passages they had assumed were clear. You are enjoying this, Lazare told her one evening, when they had been reviewing the current draft together in his chambers. I enjoy clarity, she said. Vague language in ancient compacts is how you get 300 years of misinterpretation. If we are doing this, we are doing it precisely. The court calls you the meticulous, he said, with a warmth that suggested he found this deeply endearing. That is a very polite nickname, she said. What do they call me when they are not being polite? Several things, he said, none of which will trouble you, I think, and most of which are compliments in the technical sense, even if not delivered as such. Carith Voss called me intellectually formidable last Tuesday, she said. I am going to accept that as the court's official position on me. As you should, he said. Seraphine Mordicus, as Eloise had suspected, was cleared of any involvement in the poisoning. She presented herself before the council with a dignity that surprised a number of people and a direct acknowledgement of her father's actions that was, Eloise thought, one of the more honest things she had witnessed in the court's formal proceedings. Lazare extended his protection to her, as he had said he would, and offered the Mordecris household a reduced standing pending the completion of the formal investigations. It was more mercy than most expected, and Eloise thought it was exactly right. Eloise herself moved through the transition in the court with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She did not give up her research, her flat, or her sense of herself, as a person who existed independently of the remarkable situation she had landed in. She and Lazare negotiated this with the blunt, affectionate honesty that had characterized everything between them from the beginning. The recognition that she was not a court ornament, and he was not a controlling sovereign, but two people who had found something extraordinary in each other, and were determined to do it justice. There were still difficult nights. There were court members who resented her presence and expressed it in the small, cutting ways that aristocratic spaces had always weaponized contempt. A slightly too long pause before acknowledging her in conversation, the deliberate use of formal titles that excluded her, the occasional comment positioned at the edge of hearing. She weathered these with the same composure she had brought to that first terrifying walk into the throne room, the composure of someone who knew exactly who she was and was not inviting other people's opinions of it.
Does it bother you?
Lazare asked once. On an evening when they had come from a formal dinner and she had been on the receiving end of a particularly pointed social exclusion from a group of noble ladies who had made their opinions perfectly clear without saying a single direct word. Yes, she said honestly. Of course it bothers me. I am not indifferent to it. Tell me who. No, she said. I do not need you to intervene. I need them to come to terms with reality, which will happen faster if I simply continue to exist in it than if you make an example of every person who is rude to me. I am not fragile, Lazare. Let me handle it. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as the one where he was choosing between his instinct to protect and his recognition of her competence. And the competence won because it always did. Because he genuinely respected her. You are going to tell me when it crosses a line, he said. It was not a request. The moment it crosses a line, you will be the first to know, she said. It never quite crossed that line. What happened instead was subtler and more permanent. The court was not warm, and it was not entirely accepting, but it was a place that ran on power and competence and demonstrated value. And Eloise had demonstrated all three in the most dramatic possible circumstances. The revision of the blood law, when it finally passed in a council vote of 31 to 12, carried her intellectual fingerprints all over it, and the court knew it and respected it in the way they respected legal work, which was to say with the grudging acknowledgement of people who had been trying to find the flaw and could not. Cassia was elevated to the position of court liaison, a newly created role that put her in the official structure of the Blackthorne Court, with the standing and protection that came with it. She had wept, briefly and privately, and then composed herself and thanked the king with a formality that Eloise suspected she had been practicing, and then turned to Eloise when Lazare was speaking to someone else and said quietly, I was so frightened that night. You were frightened, and you did it anyway, Eloise said. That is the only kind of brave that counts. Cassia had squeezed her hand and said nothing more, but the look on her face said everything that needed to be said. The formal revision of the blood law removed the restriction on the nature of the king's consort, replacing the requirement for vampire noble blood with a requirement for the consort to be approved by a 2/3 majority of the noble council. It was not a perfect clause. It still gave the council a degree of influence over the matter. But Kerith Voss had argued that a completely unchecked selection process created other risks, and Eloise had agreed with him, which had produced one of the more surprising moments of the revision processes when the ancient lord and the young biochemist had looked at each other across the table with a mutual recognition that had surprised both of them. You will always have my legal support, Kerith Voss told her after the vote. I do not make that offer lightly or frequently. You understand what this court needs better than most of the nobles who have spent centuries in it. I understand what logical thinking and precise language can do in a structure built on tradition, she said. That is a different skill set. It is a necessary one, he said. I am glad you are here. Coming from Kerith Voss, who was 600 years old and had the emotional expressiveness of a stone wall, this was essentially a declaration of profound affection, and Eloise received it as such. On the night the blood law revision passed, Lazare took her to the rooftop of the building that housed Nocturne and the lower court. The roof was accessible only through the court's private passages, and it had been built with the ambitions of another era. Iron railings and stone balustrades and a view of London that on a clear night went in every direction, the city lights scattered like a second set of stars below them. He had brought a blanket because he was, underneath everything, the sort of man who thought of that, and they stood at the balustrade together with the November cold, and the city spread below them, and the weight of the evening settled around them like something that had been waiting to land. It passed, she said. It passed, he confirmed. She leaned into him, and his arm went around her, and they looked at London together, the human city and the vampire court contained within it, coexisting as they always had, the vast ordinary world moving through its days in ignorance of what ran beneath it. Are you happy? She asked. The question was simple and direct, the way she always was. He was quiet for a moment, which was not hesitation but consideration, because he gave everything he said its proper weight. I am happy, he said. I have not said that with certainty in a very long time. I am not entirely sure I have said it, and meant it completely since before I was turned. He paused. I did not expect to find this. I had stopped expecting to find anything of this kind. Stopped expecting, she said. And then a waitress walked into your restaurant and taped down a power cable and told me she was a strategic thinker, he said. Which was, as I told you then, an enormous understatement. She laughed and felt him pull her closer in response to the sound, the same reflexive warmth she had grown used to and never tired of, and turned to look at him in the city light.
400 years,
she said. Approximately, he agreed. And you spent it doing what? Ruling courts and navigating blood laws and watching the world change around you. Among other things, he said. Reading, watching, learning, occasionally finding things worth fighting for and losing them. Something shifted in his face, old and real. The losing was the part that taught me the most, and now? And now I have found something worth fighting for again, he said, and I have the considerable advantage of a partner who synthesized the antidote in advance. She looked at him seriously for a moment. Lazare, the research. I want you to know that it is not because I am trying to remove the fact of what you are. I am not looking for a cure for vampirism. I am looking at longevity in cellular terms because I want to understand whether it is possible for the gap between us to close in some way. But if it is not possible, if the science genuinely does not yield anything, that does not change how I feel or what I want, I need you to know that. He looked at her very carefully. You are telling me that you would accept mortality. I am telling you that I accept reality, she said, whatever it turns out to be. I would rather have a lifetime with you than a long life without you, and if the research produces something, then wonderful, and if it does not, I will live whatever life I have with more meaning than most people get. She held his gaze. I am not going into this counting on a scientific fix. I am going into this because it is right. He was quiet for a very long moment. The city moved below them, indifferent and glittering. I have been offered the blood exchange before, he said quietly. The transformation. I have never offered it, and I would not offer it without your full understanding and willing choice. I am telling you that it exists as a possibility. Nothing more than that, not a condition, not an expectation, only a thing that exists. She had thought about this. She had thought about it since the beginning, in the careful and thorough way she thought about everything. I know it exists, she said. I am not ready to think about it seriously yet, but I know it exists. That is enough, he said. Yes, she said, it is. He turned to her fully then, both arms around her, and looked at her with the full force of that extraordinary attention, the silver eyes in the November dark, 400 years of accumulated self, held steady and present and here, and she thought she had never in her life felt so specifically and completely seen. I love you, he said. It was the first time in those exact words, and he said them with the deliberateness of someone for whom no word was accidental, someone who had waited to be certain before speaking. I am not certain I have used those words in this lifetime. I have felt things approaching it, but not this. Not you. You are specifically and precisely and entirely yourself, and I love specifically and precisely and entirely that. She put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it with a small and genuine motion that undid her entirely. I love you, she said. I have loved you since the library, possibly since the cable tape. The cable tape, he repeated. You were very charming about the cable tape, she said. I found it architecturally compelling, he said, and she laughed, and he smiled, that real and full smile that only she seemed to produce in him. And then he kissed her, with the cold November air around them, and the city below them, and Volsey below them, and the weight of everything they had been through, and everything ahead of them held gently in the space between them, real and chosen, and entirely their own. The formal recognition came 3 months later, not a wedding, not in any conventional sense, because Lazare had told her with characteristic directness that he would not presume to ask her for a permanent commitment until the political situation in the court was stable enough that she could choose freely rather than under the pressure of ongoing circumstance. But a recognition, a formal court acknowledgement of Eloise Ravenscroft as the consort of the king, approved by the revised Blood Laws Council provision with 33 votes in favour, which was rather more than the 2/3 required. Kerith Voss had voted in favour. He had done so first before any other council member, setting the tone with the precision and intention that characterized everything he did. When Eloise had seen the final tally, she had gone to find him and thanked him, and he had looked at her with 600 years of sardonic self-possession and said, "Do not thank me. I voted on the legal merits." The legal merits happened to align with the obvious correct outcome. "That is the best possible reason to vote for something," she said. "It is the only acceptable reason," he said. And there was something in his face that was the Kerith Voss version of deeply fond, which looked to anyone else like a very slight softening of the usual granite. The recognition ceremony was held in the council chamber, which Eloise had learned to navigate without thinking, every corridor and staircase memorized in the methodical way she mapped every space she inhabited. She wore something she had chosen herself, dark blue and precise, and nothing like a court gown, because she was not a court noble and had no intention of performing as one. Lazare had looked at her when she came into the chamber, and the expression on his face was one she would keep for the rest of her life. He was in formal court dress, black and silver, the circlet of office at his brow, everything that 400 years of sovereignty looked like when it was dressed for ceremony, and he crossed the chamber toward her before the formal proceedings began and took her hands and said quietly, "For only her, you look exactly like yourself." "That was the intention," she said. "It is perfect," he said. The ceremony was brief and legal and precise, all the things Kerith Voss had ensured it would be, and when it concluded, Eloise was formally recognized by the Blackthorne Court with the standing and protection of the king's consort, and the court was bound by the recognition the way it was bound by every law that passed through its chambers, with the full weight of ancient covenant and honor. There were still dissenters. There would always be dissenters. 12 votes against, and those 12 noble families would take time to come around if they ever did. Eloise had made her peace with that. She was not interested in unanimous love, which was not a thing that could exist in a court of this age and complexity. She was interested in the legal structure being sound and the people who mattered treating her with the basic respect that her position and her actions had earned. She had that. She had more than that. She had, in the underground library on the 3rd evening after the ceremony, found a notation in an archive document she had been studying that referenced a compound described in the historical vampire pharmacological texts as the Dreven serum, a substance that had been theorized but never successfully synthesized, which was said to allow a human body to process the cellular benefits of vampire longevity without the full transformation. She had sat very still for a long time looking at this notation, and then she had photographed it carefully and added it to her research files and gone back to Lazare's chambers and told him about it. He had read the photograph of the notation 4 times. "This has been attempted before," he said. "I know," she said. "The previous attempts failed because the synthesizers did not have the laboratory capacity or the understanding of cellular interface mechanics that exist now. She paused. I have that understanding. I have been building toward it for 18 months without knowing this was the endpoint. She looked at him. I am not promising anything, it may not work, but I want to try. He had looked at her for a long moment with that expression that was everything, and then he had said, whatever you need, whatever resources the court has, whatever I can give you. Time, she said, and your occasional willingness to be a research subject. You have both, he said, unconditionally. She had smiled at him, and he had smiled back, and the research had begun in earnest. That was the life they were building. Not a fairy tale in the conventional sense, nothing so simple as that. It was a life built on two people who were extraordinarily different and extraordinarily well-matched, choosing each other with full awareness of the difficulty and the cost, and the extraordinary improbable gift of it. It was vampire politics and biochemistry and court dinners and laboratory evenings and conversations that ran to 3 a.m. over documents older than most nations. It was Lazare learning to let her handle the things she could handle, and Eloise learning to let him protect her in the ways that were his nature, and both of them finding in the negotiation of those things a kind of intimacy that neither of them had expected. Cassia became, over the months, something that both of them would have called a friend if they had been in the habit of using the word simply, which Eloise increasingly was, and Lazare was learning to be. She was present in the court with the quiet competence that had always been hers, now properly recognized, and she brought to the role an attention to the human elements of court life that had always been invisible and suddenly was not. Nocturne continued to operate as it always had, the sleek and graceful public face of the Blackthorne Court, with its extraordinary food and its impeccable service and its clientele who might or might not understand exactly what they were in proximity to. Eloise still worked shifts occasionally, not because she needed to, but because she liked the work and liked the people she worked with, and liked the particular clarity of purpose that a busy restaurant service produced. The concentrated present-tense focus of it that was very different from research and very necessary in its own way. Lazare had told her once that he found it remarkable that she wanted to keep working, that she did not feel diminished by it given what she now was in the court. I am what I do, she had said. I research because I think carefully and enjoy discovery. I waitress because I like the work and I am good at it. The court is the circumstance, not the definition. Why would I stop being myself because the circumstance changed? You would not, he had agreed. That is precisely what I find remarkable. On a Friday evening in May, 8 months after the recognition ceremony, when the city outside was in the first warmth of an actual spring, and the lower court was quiet, and she had finished a particularly productive week in the research laboratory, Eloise was standing in the Nocturne kitchen waiting for a dessert order when Lazare came through the service door and stood in the doorway in his formal court attire, looking entirely anomalous in a working kitchen and entirely unbothered by the anomaly. We have a situation, she said, because his presence here in this context almost certainly meant something had happened. Not a crisis, he said, but I would like you to come with me. She handed off the dessert order to the next server and followed him. He took her down through the private passages to the lower court, through the archive corridor she knew as well as her own flat by now, and into the smallest of the reading rooms, which was lit by 3 lamps and had been set with 2 chairs and a table, and on the table was a document. Carith Voss has been doing additional legal research, Lazare said, arising from the blood law revision discussions. He found a precedent from the court records of the 14th century for a different form of the recognition we performed. Not the council vote version, which is what we used. An older version, which predates the blood law itself. He paused. It is a sovereign bond. A direct covenant between the king and his chosen, recorded in the court's oldest legal language, which binds both parties by ancient vow for as long as both live. It does not require council's approval. It requires only the willing and free choice of both parties. She looked at the document. The writing was in a script she could not read, old enough to predate standardization, but the quality of it was unmistakable. This was something that had existed for centuries before any of the political machinations she had navigated. Carith found this because he wanted to, she said. He told me, and I quote, that he was engaged in routine archival research, and this was an incidental discovery, Lazare said, with a slight and very fond expression. He is 600 years old and transparent as a new pane of glass when he chooses to be. She looked at the document and then at Lazare, who was watching her with that full and open attention, everything he was, present and certain and completely still. A sovereign bond is different from the court recognition, she said. Yes, he said. It has nothing to do with the court. It is between us, and it is permanent. It is binding for as long as both parties live, he said. Which in your case may be for a very long time, if the driven research yields what you hope, and in my case is likely to be, in the general sense, indefinite. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, standing in a restaurant corridor with a roll of tape, not knowing what was about to change. She thought about everything between then and now, the terror and the crisis and the growing weight of something real accumulating between two people who had not expected it and had chosen it anyway. Yes, she said. He looked at her. You are certain. I am the kind of certain that does not require additional deliberation, she said. I have been thinking about this since before there was a word for it. Yes, the sovereign bond was recorded that night, in the old legal language that Kereth Voss read aloud with the solemnity appropriate to something ancient and true, in the small reading room with the 3 lamps and no audience except Cassia, who had been asked to witness and who held herself with the composure of someone determined not to cry and managing it imperfectly. The words were simple and old and direct, as all the best promises were, a vow to choose and keep choosing, to protect and be protected, to stand together in the courts and the world outside them, by ancient law and by something older than law, which was the free and willful love of one person for another. Lazare said the words in the old language, which she did not know, and then in modern English because he wanted her to understand every word he was speaking. She said hers in the same way, direct and precise, and entirely meaning every syllable. And in the lamplight of the oldest part of the Blackthorne Court, with the city humming above them and the weight of centuries all around them, they kept the promise they had been building towards since a Tuesday in a corridor and a roll of tape and 2 people paying careful attention to something worth keeping, and it was quiet and it was real, and it was, in every way that mattered. Exactly right. Outside, London went on being. London, vast and indifferent, and full of lives being lived in parallel. Inside the court, the investigation into Mordecris moved forward. The research laboratory was running 3 active hypotheses, and Cassia was drafting new protocols for court-human relations with a focused determination of someone who had decided to change something for the better and had both the standing and the will to do it. And, at the center of it all, something the court had assumed was powerless had turned out to be the thing that held everything together, not because of what she was in their terms, not because of ancient blood or noble title or centuries of accumulated authority, but because of the specific and irreplaceable quality of someone who paid attention, who thought carefully, who acted when it mattered, and who loved with the same precision and intention she brought to everything else. The court had thought she was powerless, the court had been wrong, and in the private chambers of the king, on an evening that smelled of old books and cold stone, and the particular warmth of 2 people who have found their way to each other across every improbable obstacle, Eloise Ravenscroft and Lazare Blackthorne sat together in the lamplight with 400 years between them in one direction and everything still to come in the other, and were, simply and completely, home.